Patrick stood in front of the large building that sat at the centre of the compound. He guessed that it had to be at least 3 stories tall, and had a large garage door that was wide enough to fit a small jet. Whatever sat inside was the biggest mystery about the Dakar, the question they had been asking since they were first found on Earth. How had these interlopers arrived here with seemingly centuries-old technology? It was quite an amazing opportunity to be among the first humans to find out, so when he was given the mission, he volunteered his squad. The mission itself was fairly simple: accompany an envoy for a week in Dakaran territory. Of course, they weren't alone. A squad of Marines were assigned to the other diplomats, plus a translator for each of them. The 12 of them stood by in front of the large building, just waiting for the order to go in. Tanner especially seemed excited for what lay beyond. Quite frankly, they all were. Soon enough, a familiar Dakar approached them. It was one named Tshirt. He was some kind of noble or scientist. Patrick didn't really know which.
"Good morning. It is a pleasure to meet all of you, as well as see a few that I previously met,"
Tshirt said that last part, while gesturing to Patrick and his squad. Patrick's diplomat, a woman named Sophie, shook Chilukic's hand softly and introduced herself.
"Sophie Lascelles, and this gentleman right here is Edward Teach."
After Sophie, Edward also shook the Dakar's hand.
"And I am Tshirt. I am the head scientist here at this outpost."
The garage-like door proceeded to open, and everyone was invited inside. The room seemed rather plain at first glance, typical storage-like bare-bones deal, but Patrick noticed how the location was actually defended. 2 fortified positions were built on each side, where Dakaran soldiers were entrenched. They seemed to have larger versions of the steam rifles usually seen with their other troops. Their rifles were bolted down into the floor and attached to much larger tanks. With no cover possible, it would be like walking in front of a Second World War German machine gun nest. In between them, a reinforced metal door was the only other notable thing in the room. Tshirt grabbed everyone's attention and made them all move to the side. The secondary metal door opened with a wince, metal grinding on metal, revealing an archway with an eerie blue glow emanating from it. Tshirt stepped in front of the device and faced the group.
"Come, right this way."
Without another word, the Dakar stepped through the archway, sinking into the blue hue and disappearing without a trace. A Marine was the first to follow, leading his group through the archway. Patrick was close behind. He paused a moment before stepping into the haze. A strange sensation flowed over his body, as if he were submerged in water. Instinctively, he held his breath as he stepped through. It took a moment or two for his eyes to adjust the dim lighting, but soon it was clear that he was no longer in the same room he was in just a moment ago. Cautiously, he took a breath. The air was thin and stale. The room they were standing in was some kind of workshop. Strange tools were placed haphazardly around, and there seemed to be machines all around with many intricate gears. Tshirt stood patiently as everyone passed through the arch. Once everyone was through, he addressed the group.
"Welcome to Charsier, the capital city of the Dakar. You are currently standing in my lab where I spent many years developing that portal you just walked through."
Now everything about their sudden appearance on Earth made sense. For all intents and purposes, the Dakar really did appear out of thin air. Patrick's mental list of strange things that have happened in the past month or so just kept growing. At this point, the idea of a portal, let alone actually going through one, barely fazed him. Tanner, however, was awestruck, as he usually was when it came to dealing with the Dakar. At least, someone was enthusiastic about this whole ordeal. Edward stepped forward and spoke. "Are we currently underground? It's somewhat hard to breathe, and the air seems stuffy."
"Yes. Charsier is almost entirely carved out of a mountain. Most of the city is underground. Only military personnel are permitted to surface on a normal basis,"
Tshirt answered. Edward thought on that for a moment. He opened his mouth as if he was going to say something, but he hesitated. Instead, he settled with a single-word response. "Impressive." Tshirt clasped his hands together and spoke before any other questions could be asked.
"We best not waste time. There are a lot of things to do today. Mainly, you are all going to meet the Matriarch and the Council, but first I would like to go over a few things that you must abide by. First and foremost, the proper greeting, especially to those in power, should be a bow. We are not accustomed to the physical greeting that is your handshake. Second, as you are strangers to our land, it is best to avoid interacting with the general populace to avoid creating any unintended offense. If you must, it is best that you consult your guide that each group will be assigned before interacting. Lastly, it is not recommended to stray away from your guide, as many of our cities can be labyrinth-like, and it can be very easy to get lost even if you become familiar with an area. Are there any questions before we move forward?
The room fell silent. Tshirt waited a few moments before continuing, but no one spoke up. He awkwardly cleared his throat and spoke again.
Excellent. Follow me so we can get you all situated.
Tshirt led the group out of the tight lab, and onto some kind of underground street. There were a number of Dakaran guards on the perimeter, blocking and redirecting any civilians trying to pass through. Surprisingly, very few actually stopped to ogle at the group of strange beings. Most were just content with minding their own business and going on with their day, though the occasional glance was fairly common. Patrick took note of how gloomy the atmosphere of the city felt. Perhaps it was just this section, but everything seemed to be built for more practicality than any kind of visually pleasing architecture. Though Patrick supposed that maybe the city was quite beautiful to the Dakar. Dim, damp, and tight must be all the rage in that case. It wasn't really the best explanation he could have come up with. A tram sat in the middle of the street, awaiting to transport them to a different location in the city. The group gathered in front of the tram, and a guard opened one of the side doors, allowing everyone to file in. The step onto the tram was larger than strictly countable. Of course, it hadn't been designed with a human's smaller stature in mind. That being said, the tram was quite roomy and comfortably fit everyone inside. The sudden acceleration of the tram surprised Patrick. A few of them who weren't paying attention even stumbled a bit at the impromptu movement. Their ride was short-lived, however, only lasting a minute or two. The sight that met them once they stepped off the tram put the previous tunnels to shame. Designs and patterns were carved into the walls, neatly trimmed moss adorned the ceiling, and there was nearly double the space. Tshirt grabbed the attention of the group and stuck a hand out to a grandiose doorway.
Welcome to the Imperial Palace. It is the largest single structure in the entire city. The palace holds all the council members and the Matriarch, as they all have to be ready at a moment's notice in the case of a national emergency. It is also where you will all be staying while you are in Charsier. Unfortunately, I must ask that all soldiers surrender their weapons to the armory while on palace grounds, as only the royal guard may be armed in the building.
What's the point of an armed escort if they can't even be armed? Edward grumbled. Sophie leaned over to the American diplomat to comment. I'm sure the royal guard will offer plenty of protection. Besides, cooperation shows trust between our governments, no matter how little. Tshirt glanced at the two. Their conversation wasn't exactly quiet. Nonetheless, Tshirt continued the tour, seeming to ignore Edward's comment. They were led into the building and took a hard left to a doorway with several armed guards. At the end of the hallway was a reinforced steel door, where an older Dakaran soldier waited. Tshirt exchanged a few words with him in their tongue before turning to the group, specifically addressing Patrick's squad and the Marines.
This is Quartermaster Ulrich. He will be in charge of storing your weapons. Don't worry, once you leave they will all be returned to you.
Ulrich took a bow as soon as Tshirt was finished speaking and approached Patrick. Patrick sighed and turned to his squad. Condition 4, drop flags as well. There's no reason for us to be all armoured up right now. Patrick's squad began unloading their rifles and taking off their combat gear. However, the Marines opted to just give up their rifles. Ulrich and another Dakar collected the weapons before bringing them behind the steel door. As soon as the steel door was sealed, Tshirt began walking back to the main entrance, to which everyone followed.
It is time that you meet the Matriarch. As she does not speak your language, I will act as your translator for this meeting.
Sophie spoke up. We do have our own translators. While your assistance is appreciated, it is a bit redundant. Tshirt sighed, though Patrick couldn't tell if it was from annoyance or maybe something else. Dakaran mannerisms would be something that he'd have to pick up on and learn, especially considering the circumstances.
I would prefer that I be the translator. I'm sure your translators are plenty proficient. However, I personally want to make sure that there is no confusion or misunderstandings. She is the single most important Dakar, after all.
We'd rather not step on your toes, then. We'll proceed how you wish, Edward responded. Tshilukic stopped the group in the middle of the entrance hall. For a few moments they stood in awe of the structure around them. Several ornate pillars lined the walls. 5 gold crests hung high above an archway that was guarded by tens of soldiers. The floors were of polished marble, and the light shone brighter than anywhere else they had seen in the city. Tshilukic moved the diplomats to the front of the group, while everyone else stood behind them shoulder to shoulder. Once everyone was in position, Tshilukic nodded towards one of the guards. A moment later, said guard shouted something, causing all the Dakar in the room to snap to attention. Both Patrick's squad and the Marines took the cue, going to attention themselves. A figure flanked by 2 guards appeared in the archway. They slowly walked across the hallway to the 2 diplomats. Patrick could only assume that she was the matriarch, as she was dressed in an extravagant gown, and sitting atop her head was a gold crown encrusted with a single blue gem. As soon as the matriarch got about a meter away from Tshilukic, he took a bow and stepped to the side. The matriarch then approached the diplomats, and they exchanged bows. She spoke in her alien tongue, and a moment later Tshilukic spoke up with a translation. "Welcome to Charsier. We are happy to have you here. I am Tshilukic. If there is anything you need during your time here, let me know. You are our honoured guests." Sophie was the first to speak. "Thank you. It is an honour to meet you, madame. I am Sophie Lascelles, the representative from the nation of Canada." "And I am Edward Teach from the United States of America. It's a pleasure, ma'am." Ulrich and his assistant placed the human weapons on the table. Most of them were similar to the ones obtained from the crashed flying machine, however one looked very different. It was considerably larger and even had a handlebar attached to the side of the barrel. Charsier picked it up to inspect it. It was almost twice the weight of the other rifles. He noted that it shared a few similarities with the mounted gun they also had captured. "Was there any trouble with them handing over their weapons, Ulrich?" "No, sir. A few of them even dropped off their armour." Ulrich held up a helmet with a distinct human pattern on it. Charsier placed down the weapon and grabbed the helmet. Despite its relatively small size, the helmet had some heft to it. Whatever strange material it was made of was very dense, though he doubted that it could stop very much in terms of projectiles. Charsier ran his fingers across the fabric cover. It was unlike any cloth he had seen before, and was very finely woven. "I want a detailed sketch of this pattern. I believe it is some sort of camouflage. We won't be able to replicate the material, but perhaps we can use the pattern." "Yes, sir." Charsier placed the helmet down and pointed to the large rifle. "I want that to be analysed the best you can without damaging it. The human should be busy for at least several hours, so take your time and get every detail. Learn what you can about this equipment. I want a report before the day is over." "It will be done, sir." Ulrich saluted Charsier, then waved over several other officers, and they got to work. No matter how the situation went with the humans, they were going to get something out of it, even if it was a few drawings. Yesterday played through Patrick's mind. While at first he was amazed by all the things he saw and the people he met, it started to get menial after the first few introductions. The whole day was just a bunch of formalities that he just didn't really care for. Meeting the council was the worst of it. He couldn't even remember a single name there if his life depended on it. Near the end of the day, the Americans had split off from them, and they went to meet their guides. The one his group was assigned was a young Dakar by the name of Shri. Apparently she worked under Tshilukic for a time, but decided to pursue a different career around the time the portal opened. Patrick didn't know the details, but it did make him wonder why she left. It wasn't really his business. Perhaps she just didn't like being a scientist or whatever she did. When they first met her, she seemed to be very reserved, only speaking a few words at a time. Now that the initial meeting was over, and it was a new day, she had opened up a bit. The tram lurched to a stop, dragging Patrick from his thoughts. Wolf, their translator from the US Air Force, spoke up. "Shuri says that we've arrived." Everyone stood up and filed out of the tram. They were deep within Charsier. The tight tunnels were almost suffocating. Crowds of Dakar stood next to a train stop, barely hitting the group of humans any attention. It reminded Patrick of human cities where everyone just wanted to mind their own business and get on with their day.
In fact, the only one who seemed interested in them was a child who couldn't stop staring. Patrick gave the child a soft wave and smiled. The kid shyly hid behind what Patrick assumed to be one of their parents. He must have been a strange sight to them. Perhaps he had scared the child by mistake. The supposed parent took notice and looked over at Patrick. As soon as their eyes met his, the Dakar quickly looked away. It was strange. All the civilians seemed very jumpy whenever they were around. Patrick thought back to what Strulkurig had said about not interacting with people who weren't directly involved with diplomatic proceedings. David leaned over and whispered to Patrick. "I can't say I like the kind of looks we're getting. It's best to just ignore it. People will be people, alien or not." David leaned back and looked forward as the train pulled in. The doors opened and people started flowing in. By the time Patrick's group had made their way inside, the train was completely packed. If he didn't feel claustrophobic before, he certainly did now. A loud yelp sounded out, quickly followed by Martin speaking quickly. "Ah, shit. I think I stepped on someone's tail. Wolf, tell them I'm sorry. It was an accident." Just as the door closed, Patrick got forcibly squeezed between Tanner and some poor Dakar. Any attempts from the civilians to avoid the humans was now futile. It was an uncomfortable situation for everyone. Hopefully it wasn't going to be a very long train ride. Patrick was getting hot, and he could only imagine how the Dakar felt with all that fur. After a few minutes, Patrick felt something tugging on his shirt. He turned his head to see a familiar Dakar child trying to get his attention. Curiosity must have gotten the better of them. They spoke something. Patrick felt somewhat bad about not being able to understand or even reply to the kid in any meaningful way. He thought for a moment before ruffling through his pockets for something that might interest the kid. Patrick pulled out a pen and a notebook. He opened the notebook and showed the kid how it worked. The kid's eyes widened as he saw Patrick draw a few lines. What really seemed to excite the kid was when he handed the items over so the kid could try it themselves. Patrick watched the kid draw to their heart's content. It was something to take both of their minds off of the train ride and pass the time. Before Patrick knew it, the train had begun to slow as they neared their destination. The kid's tail drooped and he wore a disappointed look. Timidly, they went to hand the notebook and pen back, but Patrick stopped them. Patrick gently pushed the items back to the kid, who now seemed confused. "Keep it, kid. I think you'll enjoy it a lot more than me." The kid took a few moments to process Patrick's intent. When it finally clicked, the kid jumped with glee and hugged Patrick. He got a few looks from the Dakar in the train. However, they seemed more surprised than the sour glances they had previously been giving him. "What did you do to make him so happy?" Tanner asked. "Hearts and minds. I gave him a little gift." Patrick smiled back. The doors opened and the pressure was finally released. Stepping out of the train, Patrick noticed that the air wasn't nearly as stale as it had been in Charsier. Every breath was almost fresh and refreshing. They had only been on that train for maybe 30 minutes. Perhaps now they were closer to the surface. The train station here seemed a lot less packed as well. Patrick was thankful for that much at least. "Wolf, could you please ask Shri where we are now?" Sophie asked. Wolf relayed the translated questions to Shri, in which she answered with a brief response. "This city is called Strulkurig. Apparently it's a very important city to them." Initially, the city seemed very similar to Charsier. Long tunnels stretched for seemingly miles. However, after just a few minutes of walking, they arrived at an opening to a gargantuan cavity. It was in the shape of a dome, reaching nearly a mile across. At the top there was a large hole leading all the way to the surface, and at the bottom was a lake that took up most of the cavity. The vast majority of the city seemed to be built into the walls of the cavern, only slightly built onto the lake itself. Large metal supports lined the walls, assumingly to ensure the structural integrity of the walls. The amount of engineering that went into all of this must have been immense. Shri began speaking, and a moment later Wolf started with his translation. "Most of the cavern is natural. The location was ideal to provide a central water source to the other cities. In fact, 80% of the water that Dakar uses is sourced from this spring." "And how many cities draw their water from here?" Sophie asked. 9, including Strulkurig. The reservoir is extremely deep and is naturally replenished via surrounding groundwater.
Patrick could see how important it was that this city remain protected. If that water supply was contaminated or poisoned, it would be catastrophic for the Dakar. The fact that they were allowed into Strulkurig at all showed quite a bit of trust. Though Patrick couldn't help but think that all this openness was an effort to draw their attention from something else. All this effort to build their cities underground, and for what? The Dakar were hiding something, or perhaps they were hiding from something. Their first stop of the day was a ration centre. It looked like any other cafeteria from Earth, though instead of a wide selection, pre-made rations were handed out. The amount of food per meal seemed like the bare minimum, just enough to survive on. Charsier walked over and grabbed one before showing it to the group. Wolf was quick with the translation. He seemed to be getting better at the language. She says that this is a standard civilian ration, about 1,000 calories, and each person gets 2 per day. Each ration is carefully constructed to sustain the nutritional needs of the average Dakar adult. However, there is rarely enough for everyone. It's not uncommon for them to turn down many when the day's rations are depleted. Patrick looked to the line that extended out of the building. There was a concerning amount of children in that line waiting to get their rations. It made him uneasy knowing that many of those children wouldn't even get to eat, especially the ones farther back in the line. It was already clear to Patrick that whatever the Dakar were going through, they needed the support from humanity. Tanner began to pull out some of his MREs, but Patrick stopped him. Put it away. You can't feed all of them. After this mission, the supplies from the US will come in. Then there'll be enough for everyone. What if they don't make it that long? Half these people are practically skin and bone. There's nothing we can do at the moment, and I need you to be on your top game for the rest of this mission. Save your food for yourself, Patrick commanded sternly. Tanner begrudgingly stuffed the food back into his backpack. They were there for only a few more minutes before departing to their next location. Throughout the day they went from place to place. Each looked more sorrowful than the last. What really broke Patrick was when he saw kids working in factories. They couldn't be much older than the kid he had met on the train. Patrick couldn't imagine what could have led to the Dakar using these methods. They were either really desperate, or had some really messed up morality. The one saving grace about it was that they seemed to take the kids' safety as priority, having an adult supervisor watching over them constantly. Though that still didn't excuse child labour. If it was up to him, Patrick would give all the resources his country could offer to get those kids out of the factories. Patrick laid in his bed. It had been almost an hour, but he just couldn't sleep. It was still pretty early in the morning, but he figured that he wasn't going to get much rest anyways. He slowly slipped out of the Dakaran bed. It was large and square in shape. The one thing that made his stay in the Dakar well bearable, there was plenty of space to sleep. Patrick pulled in his uniform, making sure to be especially quiet, as to not wake his squad mates. The apartment building was just as quiet. It seemed like it was too early, even for the Dakar. Patrick stepped outside, taking in the fresh morning air. Unlike most other Dakaran cities, Comtortum was mostly above ground. Patrick certainly wasn't complaining. For almost a week they had been exclusively underground. He strolled down the street that had a thin layer of snow that had fallen throughout the night. The air was still and cold. If he closed his eyes, he could almost imagine that he was back home. He walked until he arrived at an overlook that gave an amazing view of the relatively flat lands nestled by a massive mountain range. Looking to the left, far in the distance, Patrick could just barely make out the structures Charsier. Panning right, he could see Strulkurig with its few surface buildings that surrounded the whole. Finally, he looked over to the right towards Ethlond. Patrick had remembered that the Americans would be there today, as that was the last city they were going to visit. Patrick had to do a double take as he saw large black plumes of smoke emanating from the city. He knew the Dakar relied heavily on steam, but he had never seen steam engines produce that amount of exhaust. His heart began to pound as he thought he could identify several fires throughout the city. Patrick stepped away from the overlook and began walking back to the apartment building. Then, as he thought more about what could be going on in Earthlond, he ran. It could be some kind of misinterpretation, but he didn't want to take that chance.